Over the next few moments, I'd like to share some thoughts on suicide and self-harm assessment in adolescence. Intentional self-harm is common, occurring in up to 8% of the young people we see. It's often, but not always, impulsive, with the decision frequently made in the hour leading up to the act. Cutting is one of the most commonly reported modalities of self-harm. Working with adolescents who are suicidal or self-harming can be challenging. Females are around 6 times more likely to engage in self-harm and are also more likely to experience continuity into adulthood. There is reason for hope, however, as up to 90% will discontinue by the time they reach adulthood. Work to mitigate the psychosocial forces driving self-harm can therefore produce profound downstream benefits for our patients in later life. There are many ways of conceptualising suicidal and self-harming behaviour, and no specific model is right. Nonetheless, I'd like to flag one construct proposed by now late American suicidologist Edward Schneidman, which I found helpful. Schneidman identified that the suicidal person is experiencing an overwhelming emotional pain, akin in many ways to physical pain. He observed a simultaneous constriction of both the person's worldview and capacity to think flexibly. This is sometimes called cognitive constriction or suicidal blinkers. You can appreciate that being constrained to a negative viewpoint and struggling to problem solve makes becoming stuck in a dangerous cascade of suicidal thinking much more likely. Schneidman argued that these two factors, pain, which he described as psychache, and constriction coalesce to increase a person's risk. This becomes relevant in our work, gauging the young person's capacity to problem solve, then quantifying and describing the level of pain they are experiencing can be both therapeutic and informative with regards to risk. Young people who self-harm are often stuck in a self-reinforcing loop of adversity and isolation. Anxiety and sadness, feeling stuck in a relationship bind, antisocial behaviour, drug and alcohol use, socioeconomic strain, all these things increase the chances of impulsive action and inhibit problem solving. Self-harm in itself is predictive of eventual death by suicide. It increases the risk up to tenfold. So it's really significant. This flies in the face of the oft-present systemic and cultural pressure to view self-harm as an attention-seeking manoeuvre which can safely be dismissed. In reality, this subset of the adolescent population present a much higher risk. One way of understanding this increased risk of suicide stems from self-harm progressively building capacity for noxious harm toward the body. This links to a theoretical framework put forward by suicidologist Thomas Joyner. Joyner wondered what differentiated those completing suicide from the much larger population experiencing suicidal ideation who do not act in a lethal way. He proposed that 3 key elements coalesce to increase the risk of suicidal action. First, one has to override internal resistance preventing us from deliberately causing damage to the body. Joyner saw this as a process of acquiring capacity to override instinctive self-preservation, in the same manner as graded exposure. It's not uncommon for us to hear stories from young people describing how the dangerousness of their self-harm has escalated over time. Joyner makes the point that in a way self-harm is preparing the ground for lethal suicidal outcomes. Or put another way, self-harming adolescents in our clinical work sits somewhere on a spectrum of desensitisation heading toward possible outcomes of suicide. Joyner also observed that people who complete suicide tend to see themselves as a burden on those around them. The notion of "they'd be better off if I weren't here" often points to this kind of mindset. To stir up this already dangerous substrate, Joyner noted that the suicide completers tended to feel little true emotional connection to those around them. In a CAMS assessment, this raises the question, does the young person experience a tuned emotional connection with anyone, or are they isolated? Obviously, there's a group of young people who present to CAMS with openly expressed suicidal thoughts and behaviours. That a risk exists is pretty self-evident in this situation. At other times, young people presenting for help may be experiencing unspoken suicidal ideation. The young person with social phobia is an example here. There's also a group of young people who present with medical issues. There doesn't appear to be a mental health issue on the surface, yet they have a silent or hidden suicidal ideation. As CAMS clinicians, we might become involved with these cases in a consultation liaison capacity or as a second opinion from our medical colleagues. These different modes of presentation highlight the importance of routinely checking in about self-harm and suicidal ideation and working to generate a robust alliance such that issues can be comfortably raised. A related issue is that you simply can't do a good risk assessment in 5 minutes. You can't accurately gauge risk based on a brief checklist. You need to invest time. The work can be emotionally taxing, so be kind to yourself and bear in mind that we all have a limit. There are times for all of us where it becomes necessary to pause, take a break, and ask to see a different patient, perhaps even change up our caseload, especially when we notice our ability to reflect and be empathic is drifting away. Patients are far less likely to be candid with regards to their experiences when feeling confronted by the therapeutic space. A specific suggestion when taking a history around suicide is to come alongside the young person. Co-construct the story rather than sit opposing them, which tends to invoke the traditional expert interviewing dynamic. So how do we pragmatically go about doing a suicide assessment? I'd like to share some ideas, but make no claim to presenting a comprehensive framework here. For me, the first step is to invest heavily in rapport building. Survey the young person's relational world with the help of a genogram, then look for a moment where you can segue into a behavioural incident. When exploring a behavioural incident, I hold on to the idea that, like most stories, it will have a beginning, middle and end. Ideally, we want a moment-to-moment description of how the suicidal episode emerged, first as a nascent concept, then into an intention, crescendoing into an action and the impact this had on people around the young person. Along the way, it's important to check that you're not missing any other areas of risk. As a minimum, cover alcohol, drugs, panic and anxiety, intrusive thoughts, psychosis, and any other issues around self-harm and suicide that you haven't yet tapped into. Safety and sexuality are also things that easily go under the radar. Then build a shared explanation of what's happening with the young person. This critical step allows you to check that there are no muddles made in terms of the meaning you attribute to the story compared with what the young person believes is going on. Obviously, you then move into making a decision about what needs to happen in the face of the risk you've identified and decide upon the level of support and containment required, including setting up a safety plan. I often find, once I've got a really good understanding of that most recent suicide event, that I move back into broader self-harm and suicidal behaviours occurring over the past few months. I survey that proximal historical phase for suicide and self-harm and try to work out what forces have operated to escalate things over that time. Once this is done, I tend to move back even more broadly into the general history of this young person's life. How much has self-harm and suicide played a role? Then I seem to instinctively come back to the here and now. I gently challenge the young person to assess the impact of talking through the story in the moment. What residual intent do they have? What thoughts, if any, of self-harm and suicide have been stirred up by the process of our talking? This is one workflow for charting self-harm and suicide within a session. Like all assessments, there are specific interview techniques woven into the behavioural incident. They help us check that the history we're getting is accurate. The suicidal crescendo can often act like an anchor point in the conversation, an established piece of the story which can be returned to when necessary. Generally, however, we reach a point where the leading edge of the story seems to trail off. The young person might not offer as much information, or the narrative might threaten to stall. What you can use here is a gentle assumption, intuiting and tentatively proposing based on the information offered so far. Aside from the tablets, how often do you hurt yourself in other ways? How often do you cut? There's an assumption that something is happening built into this kind of statement. The assumption can be comfortably debunked by the young person if it's inaccurate, but at the same time it has the effect of giving permission to share gritty reality rather than defend or minimise. A related approach is sometimes described as denial of specific. It's not uncommon for our young patients to deflect away from their real experience because they feel ashamed or want to protect us from feeling something uncomfortable. Quite simply, with this approach, you have a list in your mind of possible modes of self-harm or suicide and confront the young person with them, again gently, but one by one. Have you thought of other ways of hurting yourself, like driving your car off the road? Pause and wait for the young person to answer that question before you move on to the next possibility that's in your mind. Have you ever tried to hang yourself using a rope? You're being very specific in a way that tends to invite more honesty than a general survey question might. Have you tried other ways of hurting yourself? No, says the young person. With this last one, blunt, inaccurate denial seems more likely. Another technique is symptom amplification. Here we deliberately overestimate the frequency, intensity or pain associated with a part of the suicidal story. In a way, the clinician here is setting an extreme contrast point against which a description of reality might feel to the patient more bearable or describable. We're essentially jogging the young person into a space where they're more likely to provide an undefended, accurate estimate of their experience. Thoughts of suicide, are they continually on your mind? Every hour? Once a day? And so on. The other tip I wanted to share is that in most stories of suicide, there's evidence of ambivalence, a point in the narrative highlighting a nidus of hope or residual attachment to life if only something could be different. In my experience, the thing that would need to change tends to be a relationship bind or perhaps reducing one's sense of isolation. The point here is going into an assessment with an assumption that no matter how entrenched the suicidal narrative might seem, there will be a nidus of hope to be excavated somewhere. This tends to help you identify the most impactful stresses as they emerge and to manage the risk of hopelessness that can often be projected into ourselves as clinicians. One approach to locating this ambivalence is to have the young person list things that are keeping them alive and things that are pushing them toward death. Being really explicit and generating a prioritised list can bring the young person in contact with that often submerged hope. So I might say to a young person, bear with me if you can, but could you give me perhaps 5 things that really push you toward wanting to be dead? Often you'll get a bit of resistance. I don't know, or I can only think of 1 or 2. You need to persist, and even so, if you get 2 or 3 on the list, that gives you a good start. And then of course we contrast, what are the things that keep you alive? Can you provide me with a list of those? There often seems to be a key relationship, a key person or aspiration the young person has upon which the ideas of living are hinged. This is a point you can head toward as a high yield space within therapy. The other thing you can do at this point is to get the young person to rate the attraction they feel toward death compared to staying alive. This can help fine-tune your understanding of where they sit on the spectrum of ambivalence regarding life and finality. The magic wand question can come in handy here too. If there were one thing that could change in order for suicide to no longer be necessary, what would that be? What would have to happen, and how would we know it's happened? This is kind of engaging the young person in magical thinking to have them project forward into what needs to change in their life in order for the suicidal drive to drop off. Suicide assessments generate a lot of data, which needs to be integrated into a conceptualisation of risk and meaning. Here's a suggestion of some key elements which, when considered together, give you a gestalt impression of risk. Intent and lethality need to be considered, and here intent refers to how committed the young person is to following through with their suicidal self-harming behaviour. Lethality is the objective dangerousness of the chosen means. These two factors need to be matrixed together to generate an impression of seriousness. An example might be that a young person holding an incredibly strong intent to kill themselves habitually chooses low lethality means, resulting in a lower risk than someone who holds low intent but inadvertently chooses exceedingly dangerous means. Think of a gun or amitriptyline tablets here. Remember, of course, that real suicidal intent isn't just what's said during the interview. It's the combination of what's said in addition to what's reflected and what's withheld. Stated intent is pretty obvious, but what about this reflected and withheld? These are the plans or ideas inferred in conversation which you intuitively pick up on as markers of suicidal risk, yet tend to be defended or denied by the young person. There's a need to look for these sort of bits of suicidal risk which are actively withheld, which bits are pulled away from conversation when you go near them. To make an accurate assessment of seriousness, you need to not only matrix together the intent and lethality, but also you need to be looking at what's stated, what's reflected, and what's withheld. Going back to Thomas Joyner, these elements point toward acquired capacity to follow through with self-harming and suicidal behaviour. How much has the young person overridden that internal resistance to self-harm? The next part, referencing the genogram in particular, is considering the level of relational and emotional scaffolding available to this young person. What does the level of family functioning look like, and how much other support is available? This is important because a young person who presents a reasonable level of self-harm or suicide risk, yet has access to attuned and responsive family members, might be able to be managed relatively safely, or at least in a less restrictive way. On the other hand, a young person with lower intensity suicidal thoughts, but with little access to support or perhaps even an actively traumatic family system, may need a much more assertive containment within the health system for a period of time. A final pivotal question is, do I get it? Do I get why this young person has ended up feeling suicidal at this point in time? Can I see the relational bind they've been stuck in, for example? If you do, tentative confidence can be had in the risk assessment, whereas when the story and drives towards suicidal behaviour simply don't hang together in an intelligible way by the end of the assessment, this is a cue for caution about the accuracy of the risk assessment. Once you've decided upon the level of containment required, the next step is to put some safety plans in place. It's easy for these safety plans to become generic and a hollow exercise, much harder to set up contingencies which feel relevant and impactful to the patient. We're going to spend some time during other parts of the training course to think together about how we might do this in a meaningful way. Some other ideas regarding immediate assessment and safety planning, and perhaps ones that are very obvious. Remove access to means and talk with parents about doing this. Identified stratified contacts for the young person when in crisis, not just 1 or 2 phone numbers. Start to work with the young person to identify some pragmatic strategies they can use to deflect away from the suicidal trajectory when it starts. And also start to put some effort into behavioural activation. This includes psychoeducation about emotional pain reduction following increased function. With regards to longer term management, don't shy away from encouraging the young person to tell and retell their story of the suicide or self-harm attempt. Some people worry this might encourage further risky behaviour, but in reality it seems to encourage working through. And as that story is retold, slow the process down as much as possible. Pause frequently, elaborate and unpack labels and assumptions using Columbo-style curiosity. Over time, look for echoes or parallels where the fundamental relational bind that seemed to drive the suicidal behaviour seems to pop up in the relationship with you. If you can, tentatively raise their awareness of this and monitor their response to that gentle interpretive interaction. It can be incredibly hard to get a safety plan to stick for a young person, so be prepared to revisit, revise and rehearse over time until it becomes more useful. And work toward a shared explanation for the suicidal drive. Talk about suicidal blinkers, think about mood triggers, and also raise the concept of mental pain.